that's about all.
Yes.
Cabbage, turnip, and carrot were the main things, and parsnip.
And parsnip, yeah. And you didn't grow peas?
No, we didn't grow peas, and we didn't grow beans or any of the things.
Lettuce, you didn't grow lettuce?
No, I never saw lettuce or
beets.
Never heard of some grew beets,
Swiss
but
chard?
we weren't fond of beets, so Mother never bothered that much.
Yeah, Swiss chard, did you ever grow them? No.
None of the only greens we had were turnip tops.
Yes.
And everybody grew enough, sowed enough seed to pull up some turnip for turnip tops.
Yes.
Oh yes, and onions. We put in small onions.
For generations, Newfoundlanders have confined themselves to growing potatoes and small seed. Small seed are carrots, turnips, cabbage, and maybe a few beet. These limitations must have been imposed by tradition, as they certainly weren't imposed by climate. Here in Logie Bay, we grow close to 50 different varieties of vegetables. When you sit down with a seed catalog, you're going to be overwhelmed by the enormous varieties of vegetables which are available to you. How are you going to choose between 20 or 30 different varieties of carrots? How are you going to choose between 300 or 400 different varieties of vegetables? You can't play eeny, meeny, miny, mo. You're going to have some knowledge to base your decisions on so that you make intelligent decisions and not just pure guesswork. Because it's been pure guesswork, it was the way that I found out what vegetables to grow. And the purpose of this course is hopefully to make you avoid some of the mistakes which I've made. So what we're going to do in this program is go through some of the vegetables and describe some of the vegetables which I've grown successfully on my farm in Logie Bay. And I'll touch on some of the vegetables that I've grown unsuccessfully as well. If you don't know it already, I'd like to inform you that Logie Bay enjoys some of the worst growing weather in the St. John's region. It's cold, it's rainy, it's foggy, and compared to areas quite close by, like the Goulds or right around the bay, it's about 2 or 3 weeks behind the rest of the area. Now, you might live in an area which is even colder. You might live in an area which is warm enough to ripen corn outdoors. So all I can give you is a guide. Your experience and your knowledge of your conditions will have to determine the precise varieties which you're going to choose eventually. And a little experience will enable you to make wise decisions. If you feel that your area has a short growing season, then choose short season varieties. Stoke's seed catalog gives a number of days to maturity. When you read the variety, it'll say this particular pea takes 45 days to maturity, or Polar V corn takes 49 days to maturity, or Golden Hubbard squash takes 95 days to maturity. These figures are somewhat misleading, and I've got to warn you about them. When it says it takes a certain variety of pea 45 days to reach maturity, this might be pretty well correct for Newfoundland conditions. But when it says for a particular kind of bean that it takes 45 days to reach maturity, you'll probably find it's quite incorrect. The reason is what the Stokes catalog doesn't give you is that what these numbers mean is 45 days at a particular temperature. Now, peas are cold weather crops. So if you have 45 days of days which are 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you'll get maturity. But if you have a variety of corn with 45-day maturity time, and it needs 65 or 70 degree Fahrenheit days. And certainly in Logie Bay, it's a rare season that we get 45 days of 60 or 70 degree temperatures. And as a result, even with polar V, we don't get maturity out of doors. Please refer to the sheet that accompanies this lecture. It will give you a list of the seeds which I am growing this season in Logie Bay. Some of these I'm sure of, and others are experimental, and I'll try and indicate on the sheet which ones I am sure of and which ones are experimental. Some of them are designed for growing in the greenhouse. Some of them are designed for planting outside. Some of them you have to start inside and transplant outside. And all these facts will be indicated on the list which accompanies the lecture. Let's take a look at some of the vegetables that you might want to plant in your garden. Well, let me say this for starters. Many of the vegetables I'm going to describe to you are probably going to be strange and new to you. What you plant in your garden is going to primarily be determined by what you like to eat. So if you like turnips and cabbage and potatoes, then plant a good many of these kinds of vegetables. But I urge you to experiment. I urge you to broaden and try a variety of vegetables and try some of these new things. Everything that I'm going to describe to you has its place in the garden. And if you experiment and if you try some of these new varieties, like maybe some of you haven't tried broccoli or Brussels sprouts, if you try them, I'm sure you're going to like them. My gardeners who have come out with just the same limitations in their tastes have gone away with a completely new repertoire of things that they like to eat. Now, when I talk about different vegetables, what you're going to see on the screen is pictures of the package of the seeds which were supplied to me by Gay's Seeds. And also you'll see the actual seeds scattered on a piece of paper. I want you to look at the size of the seed. I want you to observe the shape of the seed. Because it's important for you to learn the size and the shape of the seed, as this is very relevant when it comes to planting time. The first, instead of describing 50 different varieties of vegetables, I'm going to categorize the vegetables. I'm going to group them into logical kind of groupings. And the first category which I'm going to talk about are the legumes. The legumes are the peas and the beans. The peas and the beans I start out with because these are probably the easiest vegetables to grow in the garden. The soil can be the poorest. The seeds are large and easy to handle. With the peas, at least, they're extremely hardy and it's very hard to fail. So let's start off by looking at the legumes. Peas and beans are delicious vegetables which, for little input in the way of effort or work, produce quite amazing crops of easily stored and very palatable vegetables. In addition, the legumes have the ability to enrich the soil in which they're growing. Now, most vegetables take nutrients out of the soil and put those nutrients into the vegetables. But legumes are unique in that they have the ability to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and transform it into nitrogen fertilizer in the soil. Peas are one of the easiest vegetables to grow. They're so hardy you can plant them as early as you can work the soil in the spring, and if they come up and you have a freeze, it won't hurt them. I've tested a number of varieties of peas in my gardens, 6 to be exact, and I've come to the conclusion that the varieties which I will recommend to you are Little Marvel as an early variety and Lincoln as a late variety. It's a good idea to plant 2 varieties of peas, because in this way you extend the season for fresh peas. Little Marvel will ripen 2 or 3 weeks in advance of the Lincoln. So you can start eating Little Marvel peas, and when the harvest is finished, you can move right on to the Lincoln and start harvesting them. You will get a better crop if you give your peas some kind of support to grow on. The varieties which I've recommended are called bush variety peas. That means theoretically that they don't need any support. But if you put bits of fir branches or old fish net or some old chicken wire down the rows where you grow the peas will grow up these support. You only have to give about 3-foot support. They'll grow up the support, they'll stay off the ground, they'll be much easier to harvest, much easier to find the peas, and you'll get a much larger crop. Beans are also a very productive crop, provided you don't have very late or very early frosts. They're a somewhat higher risk crop. Don't put your beans in the soil until the soil has warmed up in the spring. I generally don't plant until the last week in June. Usually what I do is put a planting in the last week of June and another planting in the first week in July. That means the first planting comes up and I have a very late frost, it'll kill all the beans. But there's still a second planting in the ground which can come up and take its place. I've given up on the climbing pole beans. The winds roar through Logie Bay at such a rate that the beans will be up and doing very well, and then comes a summer storm and it just tears all the leaves off the beans. So personally, I stick to the earliest possible kind of bush bean. You can buy 2 kinds of bush bean. You can buy the green bean or you can buy the yellow beans. Personally, I prefer the green beans. The yellow beans have a tendency to have nasty brownish discolorations on them for some reason. As far as I can tell, they taste identical. So you get the same taste but better looks with the green beans, I've found. But if you want, try them both. When beans are harvested, you should be able to snap them in 2. You should go crack If when you try and snap them, strings of woody material are attached to the two halves, then they have gone beyond the stage where they're good for harvesting. So harvest the beans while they're still young and crisp. There's one variety of bean which is frost hardy. This is the faba, or broad bean. These beans are shelled and eaten like lima beans. They're very good if you like lima beans, and they have the advantage of being frost hardy, and this helps you get through in certain areas where the season is very short. The following film clip is going to show you the shape of the plant and a picture of the very extensive root system of the bean. This root system bears nodules. Nodules are typical of all legumes. And what they are is tumor-like growths on the roots which bear colonies of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These are one of the very few organisms which have the ability to take nitrogen from the air and fix it into useful fertilizer in the soil. Now, if you've never grown legumes in your soil, when you purchase peas or beans, ask the seed company to send you a package of legume inoculant. This is a culture of the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And you mix this inoculant with the seeds before you put them in the ground. This means when the seed germinates, the bacteria are right there, and the process begins immediately. Fava beans, or broad beans, are an example of a group known as the legumes. The legumes include peas, beans, alfalfa, clover, and a number of other plants. What the legumes all have in common is that they have the ability to fix nitrogen. That is, they have the ability to take nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, out of the air and transform it into a fixed form, nitrate, which is useful to all living plants. Now, this nitrogen fixation process is a process which takes place in the roots. The legumes themselves don't fix the nitrogen. There are bacteria, bacterial colonies called nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which live in association with legumes. The legumes provide the shelter and support for these bacterial cultures to grow and thrive. This is called a commensal relationship. Now, when the legume is planted, this commensal relationship begins. When the roots of the legume grow down into the soil, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil invade the roots of the plants and form these nodules on the surface of the roots. And there they grow and multiply to form these large colonies. Through the growing season, then, these colonies are continually fixing atmospheric nitrogen and storing it in the soil. This builds up the concentration of fixed nitrogen in the soil. So that when these leguminous plants are killed off by the winter, the following season, the area where the legumes were planted are considerably richer in nitrogen than they were previously. The next category I'm going to talk about are the brassicas. Brassica is the generic name of an enormous group of vegetables, which most laymen would not recognize as being related at all. They include the cole crops, the cabbages, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower. They include turnips, kohlrabi, rape or turnip tops, kale, mustard, and many, many others. I treat them as a group, and you should think of them as a group, because since they are closely related, they tend to suffer from similar diseases and be plagued by similar insect pests, so that their culture tends to be quite similar. The most important disease organism of the brassicas is clubroot. You can't miss it. If a brassica plant has clubroot, when you pull it out of the ground, instead of the roots being long and thin and well branched, they're large, they're as thick as your thumb or your finger, and swollen. As soon as you see this, you know that you've got clubroot in your ground, and this is trouble. Clubroot is a fungal disease of brassica, and once the disease organism is in the ground, it's almost impossible to eliminate. The only answer is to grow your brassicas in some other area. Now, there are a number of ways to prevent clubroot from getting into your ground. Number one, don't use your garden tools in an area which is known to have clubroot. Don't ask a farmer to come in and plow your ground if there's any risk that his fields have clubroot organism in them. And if your ground doesn't have clubroot, to ensure that it stays free of clubroot, make sure that you rotate your ground. Don't grow brassicas in the same area of ground more than once every 3 or 4 years. Now, the cole crops, cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, and broccoli, they all belong to the same species and have more or less the same cultural requirements. Seed should be planted in flats, in a greenhouse or a cold frame, in about mid to early May. These transplants are grown under these protected conditions until about mid-June, or until they're between 3 and 5 or 6 inches high. I like to transplant my cole crops out into the main garden when I see the alders and the birches coming into leaf. That's the indication to me that the garden is warm enough to transplant the brassicas, or to transplant the cole crops. Now, if it wasn't for the fact that the cole crops produce enormous crops of absolutely delicious vegetables, I wouldn't recommend anyone to grow them. because quite frankly, they can be a royal pain. From beginning to end, they're trouble. The seedlings damp off. They're subject to disease. Every insect in the book appears to like to eat them. And if finally, through much trouble and effort, you've got a cabbage all ready to pick out in the garden, and you look out in the garden to go and pick it, you'll find a small neighbor boy out there, kicking it around like a soccer ball. Despite their deficiencies, there's nothing more rewarding than succeeding with the cole crops. Once you learn how to grow them, they will become the mainstay of your garden. This cabbage started out as a seed planted in the greenhouse on the 28th of March. It is now the 10th of July. This cabbage is now in a completely mature state, and you can get a general idea of the size of the plant. I want you to get an idea of the size of the mature plant so that when you're transplanting these minute little transplants, you won't tend to overplant your beds so that the plants come up too crowded. Each plant has to have about 18 inches in diameter in order to grow to form a fully mature cabbage. This is a fully mature cabbage. There's a bit of a hollow sound. It's hard. It's even starting to crack a little bit. Sometimes cabbages can split wide open if they're growing too fast in the inside and the outer leaves can't expand to meet this increased size. We'll harvest the cabbage like so. There's a nice head of cabbage. Cut it down through the middle to get an idea of the way a cabbage should look. Nicely compact head of cabbage. This is cauliflower, which has also been grown in the greenhouse. It was set out at about the same time as the previous cabbage. This is an immature cauliflower, and what I'm doing here is tying the leaves around the immature head of cauliflower. This shades it from the sunlight and keeps the head nice and pure white. It's called blanching. And here is the mature head, pulling back the leaves to show the mature head. If anybody wants to grow cauliflower, I heartily recommend that they grow it very early in the spring in a greenhouse. If you try and grow it out in the garden, they're very subject to pest attack, especially by slugs. You must harvest the cauliflower at the stage where you first start seeing little cracks forming between the curds. If you let it go any further to attempt to get it to grow bigger, it'll just get all loose and soft and lose its fine quality. You mustn't let the cauliflower grow any further than the stage when cracks start to form between the curd. It's exactly ready to harvest at this time. This is broccoli, also set out in the greenhouse, but as easily grown out in the garden. The head is held high above the base of the plant, which makes it much more resistant to slug attack. The head is a bright green color, And if you haven't tried it before, I recommend it. It's easy to grow and delicious. This is a fully developed broccoli plant, which I harvested the main central head a couple of days ago. Now you can see on the sides there are secondary heads developing all around. This is the nice thing about broccoli as opposed to cauliflower. With cauliflower, you get one central head, and then you have to pull up the plant, and the plant is finished. With broccoli, you harvest your central head, and then you leave the plant in the ground, and it'll continue to produce small secondary heads right throughout the season until frost time. Some broccolis are less successful at sprouting than others. The best type of broccoli for this kind of continuous production for the home garden is called Italian sprouting broccoli. This is taken in my garden early in November, and I'm harvesting Brussels sprouts. Note that the basal leaves of the plant have been taken off earlier. You always haul off the bottom foot of leaves from the plant, and this gives the sprouts a chance to develop. The sprouts look like little cabbages, about an inch and a half in diameter. They have a very delicious flavor. Brussels sprouts are a very late season crop. You'll start harvesting them in November. They're extremely hardy. You can leave them in the garden right up through Christmas time and harvest them on the new year. The turnip is a staple Newfoundland vegetable. But what is a turnip? To the Newfoundlander, a turnip is a large root vegetable with yellow flesh. But to the rest of the world, a turnip is a much smaller root vegetable with rather tasteless white flesh. We call it a summer turnip. In the seed catalogs, a Newfoundland turnip is called either a rutabaga or a Swede turnip. The commonest variety grown in Newfoundland is the Laurentian. It is the typical turnip which you find in the supermarkets with the purple top to the root. I grow Laurentian, and I also grow an equally good variety called the Willemsberger, or the green top turnip. Some of you may know it as a cattle turnip. The advantage of the Willemsberger, or green top turnip, over the Laurentian is that it is much more resistant to root maggot attack. The white turnip, or summer turnip, I don't recommend because it is extremely susceptible to insect attack. Also, it has an extremely short season and it doesn't store well. And this little row of turnip was planted very late in the season. I planted this turnip, I planted the seed in the garden around the 9th to 10th of July. And I planted it so late in the season for a very particular reason. I'm not in a rush to try and get my turnips to market before everybody else, but what I really want to avoid is the infestation of my turnip with the cabbage root maggot. Now, if I'd have planted this turnip in late May or June, the turnip would have been well up by early July. Now, early July is the time when the root maggot strikes. And root maggots bore into the root of turnip. They don't kill them like they kill cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower. They just bore holes all through the body of the turnip, making a mess of the turnip. So this is the 7th of October, and you can see that in 90 days there's been a really very substantial growth of this turnip. If I can, I'll cut it in half and show you that it's pretty solid all the way through. Solid, clean, right the way through the turnip. No bore holes in it. Now, another thing you might notice is these scars of cracks. Now, this is something which happens with turnips. Under conditions of varying water supply. Now, all July and well into August, the garden was really quite dry. The turnips grew very, very slowly. The young plants put down a taproot as deep as they could into the soil, and then about mid-August, when the rains started to come, the turnip started to grow extremely rapidly. And because it was growing so rapidly, inside the root, the outside of the root couldn't keep up, and it split. But it didn't split right down to the center of the turnip. It just split on the outside, and these scars formed here, and it affects the looks of the turnip a little bit, but it doesn't affect the eating quality in the least. It's very easy to cut those scars out. If you want to avoid those scars, I would suggest that you would have to irrigate, and you will have to keep the water supplied to the garden on a continuous basis. And then the root will grow in an even manner, and you won't end up with scars like this. Right, here's a vegetable which I grew in the greenhouse this year. It's called Chinese cabbage. This forms a nice tasting, rather loose-headed cabbage, and it doesn't have to grow in the greenhouse. But the reason I grew it in the greenhouse is that here they're relatively protected from pests, especially caterpillars, and these are very, very susceptible to caterpillar damage. So I've grown them in the greenhouse, and they've grown nice and clean without pest damage. Rape is a variety of turnip which is grown purely for its tops. We know it in Newfoundland as turnip tops. Kale is a very hardy brassica, usually planted in the fall. It has a very curly leaf with a rather pungent, strong taste. And the advantage of kale is you plant it in the fall and then cover it with leaves, and if you know where to find it, you can go out all through the winter and pull kale leaves and have fresh greens right through the winter and into the early spring. It's that hardy. Mustard is another quick and easy brassica. And the only place I know where you can buy mustard is from Gay's seed. I grow it as a salad green, but you can also boil it for a cooked green. The seed is planted directly in the garden, and the leaves are harvested while they are young. I use the leaves in salad as a condiment. I added a small quantity to the salad because the leaves have a very significant bite to them. The last brassica I want to describe is kohlrabi, an interesting and delicious exotic, which is fine both as a cooked vegetable and as a salad vegetable. The stem of the kohlrabi expands just above the ground. It should be harvested when it's no more than 2 inches in diameter. If left longer, the expanded portion will grow woody fibers and become inedible. Next time, I will continue with some of the root, salad, and insect repellent vegetables.